Good afternoon. All right, we're going to start. This is going to be a lightning talk. It's a 10 minutes, short one. So today we're going to touch on how to automate regulatory enforcement during software delivery. So primarily, the issue is in software delivery pipelines, we have n number of sources. Not all of them are in the same pipeline, and you have different stages between going to your staging environment to the production, and in between there are n number of security checks. Now, how do we bring that all in for the automation? We'll go through what is the motivations and what are the problems you'd face in automating this security compliance, and a couple of use cases on what we have done with that. So what are the primary drivers for compliance automation? There are multiple ways people are trying to automate these. And one of the issues that one faces is, how do we speed up the delivery process during the automation? So we have DevSecOps, SecDevOps, integration of security checks in the delivery pipelines, and automating these security checks through pipeline enforcement. And all of these are happening ad hoc. And now, one of the problems that it faces is when you present the guardrails to the developers, how do we present that it's easier for developers to use? And also, it doesn't stop them from deploying their regular use cases to their testing environments and testing. But once they start promoting to higher environments, it's easy for them to identify what checks needs to happen and then go through those kind of checks. So these checks need to be part of the delivery workflow. If we have them as a parallel system, where the software delivery happens separate from the security enforcement or verification or compliance checks, then there will be a tendency to not follow those policies, or you'll find that it slows down your delivery speeds. And all of these need to be audited and reported, and that also needs to be part of your delivery workflow. So that's the reason why you need a way of integrating your SecOps into your delivery pipeline without reducing the developer productivity. So what are the compliance dimensions? Right? Here, we are specifically looking at, say, the Spinnaker-based delivery. And in that, how do we enforce the CIA, so confidentiality, availability, and integrity for your applications? Now, not necessarily everything can be done in the Spinnaker itself. For example, when you have this availability, you're looking at the DDoS protection, DOS protection for the applications. It's done after the deployment, let's say. So that's not part of the delivery workflow. But we should be able to get the data and use that to analyze and provide the compliance there. But what we can do with the Spinnaker pipelines in the delivery process itself is to have the RBAC for your application delivery. So you enforce the compliance, separation of duties, and also you can enforce the credential requirements. And the credentials need to be encrypted, not accessible to certain set of users, but only for certain users can set those. All of these can be enforced through the delivery of the Spinnaker. Similarly, the integrity end-to-end verification. The security policies, the ensuring the vulnerability checks for the delivery needs to be integrated part of the system, and it needs to be automatic also. You don't want to have an explicit stage that's plugged in. In that case, the developers will not be able to do their own pipelines. And so these things need to happen as part of the process and have the guardrails in there, but not explicitly require every developer to know how to do these. Right? All right, and at the same time, we want to make sure that any changes that happen to the pipelines or the policies that are captured. So what are we talking about here? We have the delivery pipelines. I mean, that pipeline can be one pipeline or n different pipelines happen at different timeframes within the delivery process. But we need to enforce the process policies, like the requirements in the given production environment. It must follow through blue-green or a canary deploy, or it has to go through a vulnerability check with no critical vulnerabilities for the binary to be deployed. And you may have some additional admission policies for there. For example, for some of the VPC deployments, you may say for the production deployments, it has to be certain type of VPC with the private subnets and additional rules for the networking for it. All of that needs to happen, but at the same time, for the same binaries or applications that are deployed in, say, integration environments, you have much relaxed rules for it, where you want to be able to let the QA or developers to test it out, their applications for their dependencies. So how do we do this, right? So all these things can be done through the external policies, but one of the problems here you face is where is the data if you want to run these policy checks. So one of the ways that we have done it is we have a metadata store. As the delivery process happens with the systems that are going through the delivery, all the data for the binaries that are generated, for example, you have container images with a certain tag. They have a SHA that gets generated. So we store that information. And when it goes through a repository, the repository change information, the events are triggered. We store that information, and then the binary scan data that comes through it, the metadata for that is also stored. So once the testing runs, after the testing, there's a data that gets generated through the testing that also gets stored in there. Now, at the point when the policy admission check gets triggered, we have the data for a given binary that is being deployed, for say container tag or a VM image. For those, we have the information on what are all the checks that it went through that process. Then we can then apply the policies on that data. The policy engine, basically here, what we are using is a OPA policy. And the trigger would be at the deployment time, based on the plugin, based on the policy set in the plugin to the cloud driver, it triggers the policy engine. Similarly, there is a plugin for the Orca. Depending on the pipeline that we are running, it triggers the policy engine. And the policy engine now accesses the data from the metadata store and applies the rules on it. So here, the policy engine is a Rego policies that one can write on top of what the data that you are enforcing. And so now you have an automatic check of the policies that you want for your images that you are delivering. Right? So to give an example of, say, SoX policy. So that's one of the common policies that we see. So you have two different groups of individuals providing the approval for deployment to the production. So one of the approvals obviously comes from the QA or the developer testing, and the second one policy approval could come from the operations. So we can have the policy that says there are, during the part of the pipeline, the trigger done by the user is different from the approval done by the testing or operations. It's a very simple policy because now we are collecting the metadata from the different stages in the pipeline. We have the data available through the policy engine, and at the deployment time, we could simply run that policy and check if these two individuals are different and allow them to go to production. To summarize, there are two different things that are required for automating the compliance. One is our ability to collect the data from different stages within the pipeline. And the second is writing the compliance rules on top and that are triggered at different stages in the pipeline that act on the data that we collected. Right? So essentially, it comes down to integrating the security checks in the delivery pipeline. You do have to make sure that the security checks are done in the pipeline. And then ensuring that the pipelines, when they are run, trigger the policy checks. So you don't have to have different stages in the pipeline to trigger it. In the case of Spinnaker, you would have a plugin that would trigger the policy checks. And then you have to make sure that the admission control checks, where at the Cloud Driver plugin or the policies that you write at the admission control actually includes all the policy checks that you would require for your organization. So some of these use cases can also be simple ones like when you're deploying to AWS environment, the load balancer ports that you want to open, or the SSL versions that you want to set. All of those can be included in that, and we do use them in our delivery pipelines. So this is a lightning talk. I just wanted to touch on what are the core issues that you would face when you try to automate them, and how we are doing it for those. Any questions on that? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.